Hello, we are continuing our conversation about the challenges and successes of the civil rights movement. We are still in the textbook, Prentice Hall, United States History, Modern America. This can be found online at the National Emergency Archives or the National Emergency Library. So, we are going to talk about the frustration exploding into violence today. Many celebrated the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, yet for some African Americans, things had not changed much. In many urban areas, there was anger and frustration over continuing discrimination and poverty. That anger exploded into violence in several cities. Racial violence plagued cities. Less than a week after Johnson signed the, the Voting Rights Act, one of the worst race riots in American history erupted in the predominantly African American neighborhood of Watts in Los Angeles. Violence, looting, and arson spread for several days before the National Guard troops restored order. Watts was one of many race riots that erupted in the 1960s. The worst violence occurred in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, in the summer of 1967. In Detroit, 43 people died and property damage reached $50 million. The outburst frightened many white Americans. In most previous race riots, whites had used violence to keep African Americans in their place. But now, blacks were using violence against police and white business owners in black neighborhoods. The Kerner Commission seeks the cause. To determine the causes of the riots, President Johnson established the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission. It concluded that long-term racial discrimination stood as the single most important cause of violence. The Commission also recommended establishing and expanding federal programs aimed at overcoming the problems of America's urban ghettos. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Segregation and poverty have created the racial ghetto and a destructive environment totally unknown to most Americans. The National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders Report 1967. The Kerner Commission's findings proved highly controversial. A number of conservative commentators argued against expanding federal spending. They said that this amounted to rewarding the rioters. Others noted that the black-white split that the report described ignored other minorities. President Johnson did not follow up on the Commission's recommendations, largely because the Vietnam War was consuming enormous sums of federal money. The riots also fueled a white backlash. Many whites opposed further reforms. Checkpoint. Why was the Kerner Commission formed? It was conformed to try to find out what the cause of all of this racial violence was. New voices for African Americans. The racial rioting of the mid-1960s coincided with the radicalization of many African Americans, particularly young urban African Americans. Rather than advocating nonviolence and integration, they called for another approach. Malcolm X offers a different vision. The most well-known African American radical was Malcolm X, who was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925. He adopted the X to represent his lost African name. Little, he argued, was his slave name. Malcolm had a difficult childhood. In his teens, Malcolm moved to Boston and then to New York City, where he became involved in drugs and crime and landed in prison on burglary charges when he was 21. While in prison, Malcolm became a convert to the Nation of Islam, a religious sect headed by Elijah Muhammad. The group prescribed strict rules of behavior, including no drugs or alcohol, and demanded a separation of the races. After his release from prison, Malcolm became the Nation of Islam's most prominent minister. In 1964, however, he broke away from the Nation of Islam and formed his own organization. He then made a pilgrimage to Mecca, the holy city of Islam. Returning to the United States, he seemed willing to consider limited acceptance of whites. In February of 1965, however, Malcolm X was shot and killed. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of the murder. Young leaders call for black power. Many young African Americans saw themselves as heirs of the radical Malcolm X. They began to move away from the principles of nonviolence. They began to question the goal of integration. As SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael put it, integration has been based on complete acceptance of the fact that in order to have a decent house or education, blacks must move into a white neighborhood or send their children to a white school. This reinforces the notion that white is automatically better and black is by definition inferior. Stokely Carmichael, What We Want, 1966. Carmichael first used the term Black Power in 1966, and that year James Meredith had set off a March Against Fear across the state of Mississippi to encourage African Americans to register and vote. Meredith traveled only 20 miles before he was shot and left for dead by a white supremacist. SNCC, CORE, and SCLC members vowed to continue the march. When they reached Greenwood, Mississippi, Carmichael and some other marchers were arrested. After his release, Carmichael told a crowd that African Americans needed Black Power. He said that Black Power meant African Americans should collectively use their economic and political muscle to gain equality. Yet many white Americans felt threatened. They believed that Black Power meant black violence. Militants from the Black Panthers. Not long after Carmichael's Black Power speech, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. Almost overnight, the Black Panthers became the symbol of young militant African Americans. The Black Panthers organized armed patrols of urban neighborhoods to protect people from police abuse. They also created anti-poverty programs such as free breakfasts for poor African American children. The Black Panthers gained national attention when they entered the state capitol in Sacramento carrying shotguns and wearing black leather jackets and berets to protest the attempts to restrict the rights to bear arms. The Panthers' style appealed to many young African Americans who began to wear their hair in afros and to refer to themselves as black rather than Negro or colored. Some, following the lead of Malcolm X, changed their name and celebrated their African heritage. At the same time, the Panthers' militancy often led to violent confrontations with police. Each side accused the other of instigating the violence. So, checkpoint. What impact did Malcolm X have on the civil rights movement? The biggest impact that Malcolm X has on the civil rights movement is to move it away from nonviolent protests to more accepting of violence to get what they want and challenge the authority. All right, so we will continue on with talking about the new challenges and successes of the civil rights movement in our next video. Until then, be safe.